Things you have to be careful of when you're communicating science is you have to make sure that the science is right. That's a big factor when you're doing science communication. It's not as easy as it looks. There are a lot of articles that come out. There are, whether it be a journal article, whether it be an article on a blog or on a newspaper site, or what used to be a newspaper site, I guess. You have to make sure that you get your facts right. And sometimes I fall for some of the bad things, or not necessarily bad things, or some of the rumors or some of the theories that may or may not have been proven differently in the science literature. So it's very important to get access to that science literature. Very important to do your full research. Basically act like a real journalist, like the theoretical journalist, and you have to be careful of that, as your reputation can be at hand. And when you are wrong, or you do get the wrong facts, it's good that you are ready to say that, hey, you know what, something that I heard or that I published may not have been the exact right thing that happens, but it could have been a theory that has been proposed. So anyway, we're going to talk about that on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And today we're going to be talking about speaking up for the ocean. And something happened to me on Monday, or actually last week, where I published Monday's show because there was some new information that came out about the great white shark disappearance in False Bay and Guana Bay. These are areas that have been notorious for being able to cite wonderful great white sharks, large great white sharks. And there had been a number of theories that had been swirling around. And I did an interview on the Beyond Jaws podcast with Chris Fallows, who is a photographer, a known conservation conservationist in marine biology, definitely focusing in on the great white sharks. And at the end of the interview, Chris Fallows talked about the disappearance of great white sharks and the fact that a lot of the prey species for the great whites were disappearing. And there was a theory going around at the time, and it still continues to this day, where Australia's fish and chips market was being fueled by the prey that was coming out of South Africa. So it was being exported from South Africa, imported into Australia, and the fish was apparently being used for the fish and chips market in Australia. However, there was in the article that I read last week where there was people had solved, or researchers had come out with a paper that said, well, hey, you know what? The great white sharks didn't die. They actually were found. They were just found east of where they normally are. And so that was a big paper that came out, and definitely making news around, and we're seeing that. I'm going to try and make a video of it for our YouTube channel to go into a little bit more depth, get some interviews with the author of the article on Hawkeye Magazine, which was Dr. David Schiffman, a good friend of mine, as well as some of the co-author, Alison Koch, who is involved in the research, as well as some other people, to see if we can get to the bottom of this and get more clarity on the information. And the theory was a big one, and there was a campaign that came out of that theory to say, hey, the fish and chip market in Australia is affecting the great white population presence in South Africa. Now, there was also another theory that was going on, and that was going around. That was the orca population. There were two orcas that came in, port and starboard, that came into False Bay and were actually killing great white sharks. For a while, when we started to see less and less great white sharks, the bodies of great white sharks were showing up. I did a couple of episodes on it, and the livers were just taken out. At first, people thought that it was fishermen who were just taking the livers because maybe that became a huge market aspect, but that wasn't necessarily the case. It was great whites were being eaten. The liver was being taken out by orcas, these two orcas, and so that seems to be what has happened, and the great whites haven't just disappeared in terms of they were all eaten. They had just moved over to the east. So it was a great paper, a great episode that I did last week. But I did mention that I did do an interview at Beyond Jaws with Chris Fallows to say, hey, he went on about this theory, and this is the first time I had heard about the theory. This is the first time my co-host Dr. David Ebert had heard about the theory. And there's some belief in it. There's definitely, it was very easily believable. And the what I've discovered so far, and this is why I want to do more research in it, is the fact that the South African prey population, that fishery of a great white prey in False Bay, isn't well documented. It's not very transparent. So according to the article that I read that sort of debunked the fish and chip idea from South Africa that fuels the Australian fish and chip market, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not, but it doesn't necessarily mean it is. I mean, the fishery is not very transparent in terms of, we don't know where it actually exactly goes. Now, I have done interviews before where the shark meat from a lot of the shark fisheries in South Africa were going to Europe. So it's difficult to tell what's happening here. And as for me, as someone who's a science communicator, I want to get to the bottom of this. I don't have access to the full paper. I don't really want to pay for the full paper because I can't really afford to do that for every article that I do. However, I will speak to more people who are involved and who have access to that paper to try and get to the bottom of this. So you'll definitely see more coming out of this. But the whole point of this story, of me retelling this story, and if you want to know more about it, you can go to the episode that was just published before this about great whites and the disappearance. But the reason, my whole point of this episode is to be, as a science communicator, we have to be careful of how we publish episodes. Now, I put out a lot of episodes, and so I can only do so much research, and I can only put so much time into it, where I talk about like news, and a lot of times I talk based on articles that have been written up about papers because I don't have access to all those papers. And it's not necessarily an excuse. I should be putting in more research into certain items than others. But I go do it quickly because I put out 3 episodes. I want people just to get that information, start that conversation. Now, obviously, I want to put out things that are true. I want to put out things that are facts. Sometimes I don't have access to all the things that will allow me to conclude based on facts or full 100% facts. And that's a criticism of this show that I look at for my episodes. And I want to do more episodes that show, 100% this is what's happening, or at least like, hey, science can be complicated in this situation. So this is what one theory is saying, and this is what the other theory is saying. And so that is something that, as a science communicator, I have to be careful with. I have to take more care in putting that together. And you just can't believe everything you read right off the bat, because everybody has a motive of what they want when they want to write it. My goal is to inform you of what's happening, right? And to say, hey, you know what, there is, just based on last episode, the great white population, decreased in False Bay, but we actually found an increase in great white shark sightings east of this area, where it makes sense that the population is the adult population of the False Bay. Now, have those individuals been, cited that were in False Bay in the east? I don't know. That's what I'm going to find out more about. That's what I'd like to find out more about. But it just makes sense based on their population numbers and the way they reproduce. They're very slow reproductive animals. It means their lifespan is quite a lot. They don't have a lot of newborns every year, and so it takes a long time to get to adulthood, and so it makes sense that this is the same population because there are some adults that have been seen, and it's not just juveniles or young of the year or anything like that. These are things that it's always taken into context within that. But when you're looking at this type of work, when you're looking at communicating science, communicating conservation, you have to do your research. I've been caught every once in a while on this. And for me to come out usually with another episode to clear things up is important to me, because it's something that I want to do so that you trust the information that's coming from this podcast. But as a science communicator, I want people to be able to get the right information. They don't have to just go off and find information in other places. So as a science communicator, it's very important that we do the research, we get the facts, but it also depends on how many times a week or how many times you're publishing. And so you have to make that decision yourself to say, hey, if I'm going to do a story on something, or if I'm really going to look into it, I want to put all the information out as much as possible, like the finalized information or the most updated information, and that's what I'm going to put together. And then look at it from a different perspective. Sometimes when you're doing an interview, though, not to make any excuses, sometimes when you do an interview, somebody's going to say what they say. And, you have to look at it after, and you can put something out after saying, hey, this is a theory. There's a paper that came out saying the theory had been sort of debunked from what we read, but we don't know. And we're going to look more into it. that's something you can say, and you can just kind of qualify that, because with an interview, you never know what somebody's going to say. Now, of course, having guests on that you know will say information that's important, information that brings value to the episode, the value to the podcast, and value to your audience is also really important. So it doesn't matter if you're on TikTok, a podcast, a YouTube channel, Instagram, Facebook, or whether you blog. It doesn't matter. You have to look at what you're bringing to your to your audience. That's really what it comes down to. And the interview we did with Chris Faust was fantastic. And on that podcast, the Beyond Jaws podcast, we talk about sharks and shark careers, shark science careers, and shark conservation careers. So it's not just about the research that happens or about things disappearing or conservation. It's about everything. It's about the work that people do and getting to know the shark scientists that are around the world. Once you get to know the shark scientists, then you can start to say, okay, well now, this is kind of cool. This is the career that I want, all that kind of stuff. When other things pop up and you think it's worthy and it's valuable to the audience, it's up to you to or not to put in that part of the episode. And you have to tell the guest whether you're putting that in the episode or not. We decided to go ahead with that. We thought it was an interesting theory. I hadn't seen the paper that apparently debunked it, according to the Hackeye magazine article. And I still haven't seen the full paper. I've just seen snippets of it and the abstract and the introduction. So obviously it's something that, you have to make that decision when you're about to publish something, whether this is something that you want to do. Maybe even put in a caveat at the beginning, being like, this is a theory that we haven't proven to be right. Something that you always learn from every time you publish something that could be, seen as controversial, or that could have been, published on in the past. Just doing quick research in the future, so that's something that I should be doing and looking into. So this is what I have to do as a science communicator, as a podcaster, to say, moving forward, let's see what we can do. Let's see how we can make this podcast better. Let's make sure that the information is better. And then going forward, where do we go from here? Right? Let's start to talk to our audience about that, which is what I'm doing to you here, with you here. When you become a science communicator, whether you're doing it on a digital platform, you do it as an educational piece as part of your job, or you're just volunteering in classrooms, it's extremely important to be able to speak to the knowledge going into it and having a good background of things, especially when you don't have anything digital accessible that quickly. If you're doing something in front of a live audience, or somebody, a classroom or a class or a school, or another type of audience, you don't have access to all that information to look up. You can always say, hey, I'll get back to you. That's a great question. I'll get back to you. I don't know for sure, but here are my thoughts on it. And then come back with the answer later on. There's nothing wrong with doing that in the future. But if you're going to talk about a subject matter to a classroom or to some kind of audience where you're in person, then it's good to do the research around the specific topic that you're talking about, and maybe some ancillary topics that are attached to your main topic. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. Obviously it's something that I'm very concerned with my podcast, making sure that when guests come on, when they talk about something, it's important to be able to say, yeah, this is true, or hey, this was debunked by an article that that talked about that, or somebody came out with a response. Something in science that happens a lot. There'll be an article that's published in a journal article, let's say, or something that's been said, out in public, that may or may not be true, or there are scientists who do not agree with the methodologies or do not agree with the way that's being proposed, an idea is being proposed. And there'll be a debate probably going back and forth a little bit. So there'll be a response in a journal article, maybe the same article or the same journal, or there'll be something that's said at a conference or something like that, and then they'll go back and forth with a debate, a healthy debate, with critical thinking and so forth. And that's good for science. That's something that I really like, as long as the science is not, it's the debate is based on facts. The debate is going back and forth saying, hey, you know what? I don't necessarily agree with this methodology. Let's go back and forth. It's not promoting what I call, sort of fictional science. It's promoting just a different way of doing things. And I think that is important. That's important to science, to challenge each other, to criticize each other. As scientists, we're taught to criticize each other. And so that will be something that will always be around in science, and that's something that's very healthy for science, and it's something that we'll need to to continue to do in science. It'll be usually it's between scientists or among scientists, and there's debates going back and forth where points and facts are put into a peer-reviewed journal, and that is, each of the journal articles are substantiated by other reviewers and editors and so forth, and that process continues to go on. So that's what I want to talk about science communication today. It's something I don't always talk about, but it's extremely important when you're covering articles or you want to say something about science or a topic or an idea. Be sure you've done your research, including myself. This is not just for you; it's for me as well. I remind myself to do that a number of times, and so that's something that we need to do better as science communicators, and always have that in the back of our mind to bring the value to your audience. Not just because it's a conspiracy theory or an idea that's not based in anything, but something that you put together because you think it's bringing value to the audience and to the subject of science. So that's it for today's episode. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what I've talked about today in terms of science communication, integrity, and moving forward. But I think that's something that is important to me, and I hope it's important to you if you're a science communicator. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can DM me on Instagram at howtoprotecttheocean, or you can contact me through the website, speakupforblu.com/contact. You just go and fill out the form. It goes right to my email. And if you want to leave me a voice message, because I'd love to hear your voices, please feel free to do so. All you have to do is just leave a voicemail on the site. There's a little microphone on the bottom right. You just click on that, leave a voicemail, and boom, you're ready to go. And I'll be able to listen to your voicemail and get back to you as soon as possible. But that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us here on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you soon and talk to you next time, and happy conservation.